Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the fifth installment of Star Wars Republic Commando Hard Contact by Karen Travis, as you may know. And I hope today was a great day, and whether it's night, morning, or midday, I hope you enjoy this story as well. It really begins to pick up here, and it gets kind of exciting. Maybe you can't go to sleep watching this, but let's see if I can soothe the action with my monotone voice and Shatner-esque pauses. And without further ado, let us continue. Chapter 5.
Think of yourselves as a hand. Each of you is a finger, and without the others you're useless, alone. A finger can't grasp or control or form a fist. You are nothing on your own and everything together. Commando Instructor Sergeant Cal Scorata.
Darman moved on fast up a tree-covered slope a kilometer south. He planned on spending the rest of daylight hours in a carefully constructed hide at the highest vantage point he could find, slightly below the skyline. He concentrated on making a crude net out of the canopy cords he had salvaged. The activity kept him occupied and alert. He hadn't slept in nearly 40 standard hours. Fatigue made you more careless and dangerously unfocused than alcohol. When he had finished tying the cords into squares, he wove grass, leaves, and twigs into the knots. On inspection, he decided it was a pretty good camouflage net. He also continued observation. Kilara was astonishing. It was alive and different, a riot of scent and color and texture and sounds. Now that his initial pounding fear had subsided into general edginess, he began to take it all in. It was the little living noises that concerned him the most. Around him, creatures crawled, flew, and buzzed. Occasionally things squealed and fell silent. Twice now he's heard something larger prowling in the bushes. Apart from the brief intensity of Geonosis, Darman's only environmental experience had been the elegant but enclosed stilt cities of Commando and the endless churning seas around them. The cleanly efficient classrooms and barracks where he had spent 10 years turning from instant child to perfect soldier were remarkable. Designed to get a job done. His training in desert and mountain and jungle had been completely artificial. Holoprojection. Simulation. The red desert plains of Geonosis had been far more arid and starkly magnificent than his instructor's imaginations. And now Kilor's fields and woods held so much more than three-dimensional charts could offer. It was still open country, though a terrain that made it hard for him to move around unnoticed. Concentrate, he told himself. Gather intel. Make the most of your enforced idleness. Lunch would have been welcome about now, a decent lunch. He chewed on a concentrated dry ration cube and reminded himself that his constant hunger wasn't real. He was just tired. He had consumed the correct amount of nutrients for his needs, and if he gave in to eating more, he would have run out of supplies. There are exactly enough for a week's operations in his backpack and 2 days' worth in his emergency belt. The belt was the only thing he would grab apart from his rifle if he ever had to make a last-ditch run for it without his 40-kilo pack. Beneath him, foreign transports passed along a narrow track, all headed in the same direction, carrying square tanks with security seals on the hatches. Bark. Darman had never tasted it, but he could smell it from here. The nauseatingly musky, almost fungal scent took the edge off his appetite for a while. If he had his holochart aligned correctly, The transports were all headed for the regional depot of Teklet. He twisted the image this way that in his hands and held it up to the map onto the actual landscape. Yes, he was sure now where he was. He was 10 clicks east of a small town called Ambrani, and 40 clicks east of the rendezvous point Beta, and 40 clicks due east of rendezvous point Gamma. They picked RV points along the flight path because the Separatists would expect dispersal, not a retracing of their steps. Between RVs Alpha and Beta was a stretch of woodland, ideal for moving undetected by day. If the rest of his squad had landed safely and were on schedule, they would be making their way to Beta. Things could be looking up again. All he had to do was get to RV Gamma and wait for his squad. And if they hadn't made it, then he would have to rethink the mission. The idea produced a feeling of desolation. You are nothing on your own and everything together. He'd been raised to think, function, even breathe as one group of 4. He could do nothing else. But arcs always operate alone, don't they? He pondered that thought, fighting off drowsiness. Leaves rustled suddenly behind him and he turned to scan with the infrared filter on his visor. He caught a blur of a moving animal. It fled. His database said there were no large predators on Kalora. So whatever it was no more troublesome than the Dans. Not as long as he was wearing his armor, anyway. Darman waited motionless for a few moments, but the animal was gone. He turned back and refocused on the road and his surrounding fields, struggling to stay awake. Lay off the stims. No, he wasn't going to touch the med pack for a quick boost. Not yet. He'd save his limited supply for later, for when things really got tough, as he knew they would. Then something changed in his field of vision. The frozen tableau had come to life. He flipped his binoc filter for a closer look, and what he saw made him snap it up and gaze through the sniper scope of his rifle. A thin wisp of smoke rose from a group of wooden buildings. It was quickly becoming a pall. It wasn't the smoke of domestic fires. He could see flames, flaring tongues of yellow and red. The structures, barns, judging by their construction, were on fire. The group of people in drab clothing was scrambling around, trying to drag objects clear of the flames, uncoordinated, panicking. Another group, Ubis, Trandoshan, and mainly Weequay, was stopping them, standing in the line around the barn. One of the farmers broke the line and disappeared into the building. He didn't come back out again, not as long as Darman watched. Nothing in his training corresponded to what he was witnessing. There was not a memory, a pattern, a maneuver, or a lesson that flashed in his mind that told him how this should be played out. Civilian situations were outside his experience, nor were these citizens of the Republic. They weren't anyone's citizens. His training taught him not to be distracted by outside issues, however compelling. But there was still some urge in him that said, do something. What? His mission, his reason for staying alive was to rejoin his squad and thwart the nanovirus project. Breaking cover to aid civilians cut across all of that. The Separatist, or whoever controlled this band of associated thugs, knew he was out there. It didn't take a genius to work it out. The sprayer had exploded on landing, detonating any demolition ordnance that Darman hadn't been able to cram into his packs. The Weequay patrol hadn't called in when their masters had expected. Now the humans, farmers, were being punished and threatened, and it was all to do with him. The Separatists were looking for him. Escape and evasion procedure? No, not yet. Darman inhaled and leveled his rifle carefully. picking out an obese in his crosshairs. Then he lined up the rest of the group, one at a time. 8 hostiles, 40 rounds. He knew he could slot every one first time. He held his breath, forefinger resting on the trigger. Just a touch. How many more targets were there that he couldn't see? He'd give away his position. This isn't your business. He exhaled and relaxed his grip on the rifle, sliding his forefinger in the front of the trigger guard. What would happen to his mission if they caught him? In the next 2 minutes, reluctant to move, he targeted each Ubiz, Weequay, and Trandoshan several times, but didn't squeeze the trigger. He wanted to more than he could have imagined. It wasn't the hard-drilled training response of a sniper, but a helpless, impotent anger whose origin he could not yet begin to identify. Don't reveal your position. Don't fire unless you can take out the target. Keep firing until the target's down and stays down. And there were these times when a soldier just had to take a chance. They could be Republic citizens one day. They could be allies now. Darman wasn't tired anymore, or even hungry. His pulse pounding loud in his ears, and he could feel the constriction in his throat muscles, the fundamental human reflex to flee or fight. Fleeing wasn't an option. He could only fight. He targeted the first Weequay, a clean headshot, and squeezed the trigger. The creature dropped, and for a moment his comrades stared at the body, unsure of what happened. Darman had nothing against Weequays. It was only a coincidence that this was the third one he had killed in a few hours. And suddenly, unfrozen, the band of thugs all turned to stare in the direction of the shot, drawing their weapons. The first bolt hit the bushes to Darman's left. The second went 3 meters over his head. They had worked out where he was, all right. Darman snapped on the DC-17's grenade attachment and watched the scope as the civilians scattered. The grenade sent a shower of soil and shattered wood into the air, along with 4 of the 8 militia. He'd certainly pinpointed his position now. When he sprang to his feet and began to run down the slope, the 4 remaining enemies stood and stared for a couple of seconds. He had no idea why, but they were transfixed long enough for him to gain the advantage. A couple of plasma bolts hit him, but his armor simply took it like a punch in the chest, and he ran on. Laying down a hail of particle rounds, the bolts came to him like horizontal, luminous rain. One Trandoshan turned and ran. Darman took him down with a bolt in the back that blew him a few meters farther as he fell. When the white-hot rain stopped and he was running over bodies, Darman slowed and pulled up, suddenly deafened by the sound of his own panting breath. Maybe they'd managed to report his presence via comm leaks in time. And maybe they hadn't. The information would have been much use on its own anyway. He ran from barn to barn, checking for more hostiles, walking through the flames unscathed because his armor and bodysuit could easily withstand the heat of a wood fire. Even with the visor, he couldn't see much through the thick smoke, and he moved quickly outside again. He glanced at his arm. Smoke curled off the suit-blackened plates. Then, he almost walked straight into a youth in a farmer's schmuck staring at him. The boy bolted. Darman couldn't find any more of Hoken's troops. He came to the last barn and booted the door open. His spot lamp illuminated the dim interior and picked out 4 terrified human faces. 2 men, a woman, and the boy he'd just seen, huddling in a corner next to the threshing machine. His automatic response was to train the rifle on them until he was sure they weren't hostiles. Not every soldier wears a uniform, but his instincts said they were just terrified civilians. He was still trailing smoke from his armor. He realized how frightening he looked. A thin, wavering wail began. He thought it was the woman, but it seemed to be coming from one of the men. A man just as old as Sergeant Scarata, who was staring at him in horror. Darman had never seen civilians that close, and he'd never seen anyone that scared. I'm not gonna hurt you, he said. Is this your farm? Silence, except for the noise the man was making. He couldn't understand it. He rescued them from their attackers, hadn't he? What was there to fear? How many troops has Hoken got? Can you tell me? The woman found her voice, but it was shaky. What are you? I'm a soldier of the Republic. I need information, ma'am. You're not him? Who? Hoken? No. Do you know where he is? She pointed south in the direction of Imbrani. They're down at the farm the Kimre clan used to own before Hoken sold them to Trandoshans. About 50, maybe 60 of them. What are you going to do with us? Nothing, ma'am. Nothing at all. It didn't seem to be the answer they were expecting. The woman didn't move. He brought them here looking for him, said the man, who wasn't whining, pointing at Darman. We've got nothing to thank him for. Tell him to shut up, the woman said, glaring at the man. She turned back to Darman. We won't say a word. We won't say we saw you. Just go. Get out. We don't want your help. Darman was totally unprepared for the reaction. He'd been taught many things, but none of his accelerated learning had mentioned anything about ungrateful civilians, or rescues thereof. He backed away and checked outside the barn door before darting from the bush to the barn, to the fence, and up the slope to where he'd left his gear. It was time to move on. He was leaving a trail behind him now, a trail of engagements and bodies. He wondered if he'd see civvies, as Skarata called them, in quite the same benign way in the future. He checked the chrono readout in his visor. It had been only a few minutes since he had run down the slope, firing. It always felt like hours when he couldn't see anything but the target in front of him. Don't worry, Skarata said. It's your forebrain shutting down, just a fear reflex. You're bred from sociopathic stock. You'll fight just fine. You'll carry on fighting when normal men have turned into basket cases. Darman was never sure if that was a good thing or not, but it was what he was, and he was fine with that. He loaded his extra pack on his back and began working his way to the RV point. Maybe he shouldn't have expended so many rounds. Maybe he should have just left the farmers to their fate. He'd never know. Then it struck him why both the militia and civilians had frozen when they had spotted him. The helmet, the armor. He looked like a Mandalorian warrior. Everyone must be terrified of Gez Hoken. The similarity would have either worked to his advantage or get him killed. Down! Atten yelled. Niner flung himself flat and heard Fi grunt as he did the same. The air knocked from his lungs. An airspeeder flew over him, with a deceptively gentle hum. Atten squatted in the cover of a fallen tree, followed it with his rifle scope. 2 up, camo and custom armament, he said. Somehow, I don't think the locals drive those. Not with the mounted cannons, anyway. The hum of the engines faded. Niner struggled to his feet and regained his balance, wishing for speeder bikes in an absence of armor. The squad was too heavily laden with armor, and the armor wasn't designed for blending into the landscape, although it was a difference between life and death in a hostile territory. Protection against blaster fire, nerve agents, and even hard vacuum. And when they got to their target, it would come into its own. The armor was designed for FIBUA ops, FIBUA. Fighting in built-up areas inside buildings, urban warfare, of the kind of the galaxy now had plenty to offer. For now, they just have to make the best of the scenic part of the mission. He was tired. They all were. Not even the animal panic brought on the risk of discovery could shake that off. They need to sleep. Niner checked his datapad. There were still 10 clicks from the RV beta, and it was midday. It was much easier to move by night, so he wanted to press on and make the RV point by mid-afternoon, then lie up until nightfall. If Darman had made it, and maybe he hadn't, but Niner's mind was made up, they would wait for him. "He's back," Atten said. "Everyone down." The quiet drone of the engines interrupted Niner's calculations. The airspeeder was heading south toward them again. They froze, mud smeared and visible from the altitude, or so they hope. It wasn't entirely training that produced the reaction. Aerial surveillance was especially threatening. Niner recalled the Caminoan KE TAC-8 enforcer craft, cruising above the trainer grounds at Tapoca City, ready to pluck out and discipline any defective clone who didn't conform. They were equipped with electroshock devices. He had seen the KE TAC-8 in action just once. After that, he worked extra hard to conform. "He's on a square search," Atten said. He was turning into an excellent point man. For some reason, he was slightly more attuned to his surroundings than Phi or even Niner himself. "He must be working out from the center." "Center of what?" Phi asked. Niner forgot his fatigue. "You'll never leave your mates behind." "If he hasn't seen us, he's seen Darman. Or what's left of him." "Shut it, Atten. What's your problem?" "I've been Darman," Atten said. He said nothing more. Niner didn't think it was a good time to ask for an explanation. The engines were overhead, then the sound faded a little and dropped in pitch, but soon resumed full volume. "He's circling," Atten said. "Fearfeck," Niner said, and all three men reached for their anti-armor grenade attachments at the same time. "What's he seen?" "Maybe nothing," Phi said. "Maybe us." They fell silent. The airspeeder was indeed circling. It had also dropped lower and was now at level with the tops of the trees. Niner could see its twin cannons. His helmet wasn't telling him if it had locked on, but that didn't mean it hadn't. You could never count on tech. "Best piece of gear is the eyeball." It was the first piece of advice Scarata had ever given to them. Accelerated learning was fine, but anything direct from the mouths of men who had fought real engagements left a bigger impression. Niner leveled his rifle and peered through the scope, trusting to Blast Tech Industries that the sight wasn't reflective. He'd find out the hard way if it was. He could see the sun glinting off the human pilot's goggles. The gunner was a droid. He wondered if they felt vulnerable without any armored canopy, heads conveniently skylined for a shot. He suspected that anyone looking down from that height with a cannon or two didn't feel vulnerable at all. The fuselage banked above them and turned slowly, rising well above the trees as if the pilot was trying to get a visual fix again. It wasn't a coincidence. Niner kept the DC-17 trained on the central propulsion unit. When a flashing red symbol went off in his visor, the thing had a lock on him. He squeezed the trigger. The white-hot blast kicked his visor into blackness for an instant, and the detonation was so close that the shock wave had hit him like a body blow. He scrambled to his feet and ran. How he ran with more than 50 kilos of dead weight on his back he could never know, but the adrenaline could do remarkable things. His instinct was to get clear of debris raining down around him. Armor and bodysuits could withstand a lot, but the human instinct buried deep in him screamed louder, "Get clear!" When he stopped, he had covered 100 meters even in the tangled undergrowth of the coppice. He was panting like a moth, and his suit was struggling to cool him down. Behind him a fire burned. The smaller flames scattered around it like seedlings of a tree. He turned to look for Phi and Atten. His first thought was that he had brought the speeder crashing down on them. Did you have to? Phi was right next to him. He hadn't heard him above the noise of his own breathing. "He got a lock on me," Niner said, feeling relieved and then oddly guilty, but not sure why. "I know. I saw your D's go up and I thought I better get moving, or I'd be wearing a speedy. Atten? I can't hear him. That didn't mean anything. The close-range comm setting was only 10 meters. Atten could be anywhere. Niner didn't know him well enough to yet guess his movements, and it had been enough of a close shave for him not to spend too much time contemplating the issue. Now he was worried that he, the sergeant, the man they looked up to for leadership, had ran for it without thinking of them, and that they knew it. This is going to make a nice marker, Fi said, staring up at the climbing smoke. It would be visible for a long, long way. What did you expect me to do? Lie there and take a cannon round? No, Sarge. I thought you would manage a double tap, though. He laughed. Better make sure nobody survived. It was a remote chance, but speeders could be surprisingly robust. Niner and Fi walked through the smoke, rifles ready. Droid parts were scattered across the scene of the devastation. One scuttle-shaped faceplate staring up at the pall of the smoke as if in surprise. They don't bounce much, then, Fi said, and moved it with his boot. Atten, Fi, here. You there? Over. Silence. Fi put his left gauntlet against his ear. Niner wondered if he had now lost two men in as many days. Atten here. Over. Atten stepped out of the smoke, dragging his extra pack and scorched hunk of metal that trailed a few wires and plugs. It looked like the speeder's onboard computer. The pilot didn't bounce either, he said. Here, help me get this strapped on again. It took both Fi and Niner to lift the pack and reattach it to his armor. A few days earlier, either one of them could have managed it single-handedly. We're too exhausted to be safe, Niner thought. Time we got out of here and got some rest. I might be able to get something from this, Atten said, and indicating the charred metal box in one hand. It was the first time Niner had heard him sound remotely cheerful. Atten seemed to relate to gear better than he did to people. Worth a try. Niner took over the point position and struggled into the dense cover. He glanced back and hoped the flames would burn themselves out. They didn't have a hope of outrunning a full-scale forest fire. But maybe that was the least of their problems. And if Darman was alive and anywhere near, he'd see their handiwork, and Niner hoped he'd recognize it as such. The squad now left a couple of telltale marks of combat on a sleepy rural landscape. Whether it wanted to or not, Kilora was involved in the war. You're a Decut, Hokin said. He took off his helmet. His face was centimeters from the UB's, and he wanted to look him in the eye. As a species, they weren't prone to trembling, but this one was doing a fine job of being an exception. What are you? He whispered. A Decut, sir. You've made me look like a Decut, too. I don't like that. Hokin had assembled his entire senior staff in the room. He reminded himself that the room was in fact a disused Merle shearing shed, that his lieutenants were the 20 least stupid individuals selected from the criminal detritus that has been washed down over society's sewer to Kilora. It disappointed him that the Nemodians would spend so much on secure communications and so little on personnel. A few credits more, and he could have bought the small army he needed. The UB's Kalish was standing absolutely still in the middle of the room as Hokin circled. It might have been a female, because you could never tell with UBs, but Hokin suspected it was a male. He hadn't wanted to hire UBs. They could be unpredictable, even sly. But very few mercenaries wanted to work on Kilora, and those who did were simply unemployable anywhere else. Almost always because of a criminal record even a Hutt would balk at. And here he was, paying them what he could because Ankeet wouldn't fork over the proper support. Håkon despaired, and when he despaired of professional standards, he suspected extreme coaching was necessary to refocus the team. "So, you torched another farm," he said. "It was a warning, sir, in case they got any ideas. You know, hiding people they shouldn't." "No, that's not how this works." Håkon popped his backside against the edge of a table and stared into the anonymous masked face. Arms folded. He didn't like people whose eyes he couldn't see. "You warn them first. If they break the rules, then you punish them. If you punish them before they break the rules, they have nothing to lose, and they hate you, and they will seek revenge, and so will their offspring." "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that?" Håkon looked at the assembled staff and spread his arms in invitation to join the coaching session. "Does everyone understand that?" There were some grunts. "Does everyone understand that?" Håkon snarled. "What do we say when an officer asks you a question?" "Yes, sir." It was almost a chorus. "Good," Håkon said quietly. He stood up again. Then he took out Fulier's lightsaber, activated the beam, and sliced it through the Ubi's neck, sending the head flying, bloodless, quiet, clean. There was suddenly an absolute silence. The staff had been quiet before, but they'd been making the marginal noises of people forced to endure a burring lesson. Now there was not the slightest swallow, cough, or sigh. Nobody breathed. He peered down at the body, then at the legs of his dark gray uniform trousers. Perfectly clean. No blood. He rather liked this lightsaber now. He sat down at the edge of the desk. "That," Håkon said, "was punishment for Kalish. It's a warning for the rest of you. Now, is the difference clear? It's very important." "Yes, sir." Fewer voices joined in this time. They wavered. "Then go out and find our visitors. And you, Mukit, clear up this mess. You're obese. You understand the proper way to dispose of the remains." The group began filing out, and Mukit edged over to the neatly sundered body of Kelish. Håkon caught the arm of his senior weak-wayed lieutenant as he tried to slip through the door. "Gutanay, where's your brother and his friend?" he asked. "They haven't shown up in 2 meals, and they haven't signed off shift." "Don't know, sir." "Are they making a few credits on the side with that Trandoshan? A bit of freelance slaving?" "Sir, now I need to know. To work out if anything unusual might have happened to them." Gutanay, no doubt recalling that what Håkon had done to him when he chased the farm girl, moved his lips soundlessly. Then his voice managed to surface above the fear. "I never seen, sir, not at all, not since yesterday. I swear." "I chose you as my right hand, man, because you could nearly, very nearly, express yourself in several syllables. Sir, that makes you an intellectual among your kind. Don't make me doubt my judgment." "Not saying, sir, honest, never." "Then get out on the route they were patrolling and see what you can find." Hoken reached across his desk and took out the electroshocker. It was only an agricultural instrument for herding, but it worked fine on most non-animal species. Goutonnet eyed it cautiously. This is why I disapprove of undisciplined acts like thieving and drinking. When I need to be certain of someone's whereabouts, I can't be. When I need resources, they're already committed. When I need competence, my staff is distracted. He pushed a shocker into the Weequay's armpit. There is a Republic presence here. We don't know the size of the force, but we do have a speeder down and a large black crater at Imbrani. The more data I have, the more I can assess the size of the threat and deal with it. Understood? Yes, sir. Hoken lowered the shocker and the Weequay shot out the door, his enthusiasm for his career refreshed. Hoken prided himself on motivational skills. It started, he thought. He shut himself in his room and switched on the comlink screens. They're coming to take Kilora. Hoken had some kind of idea of what kind of deal Ankit had made with the Separatist. There had been a significant amount of construction work carried out to convert a grain store into a kind of building that had triple-sealed doors and the type of walls that could be sterilized with extreme heat. Then he had to try to make credible bodyguards out of the rabble he employed because important Separatist scientists came and went. And the Nemodians saw conspiracy everywhere they looked. They weren't always wrong about that. Then the Jedi came to Imbrani, and it fell into place, as neatly as the arrival of the Republic forces now on the planet. There was a military target here. I am my father's son, though I'm a warrior. Hoken wondered if all cultures separated from their heritage would be unable to move on, doomed to relive old glories. I'd rather be fighting a worthy opponent than terrorizing farmers who haven't got the guts to stand up for themselves. Fighting soldiers also commanded a higher fee, of course. And the greater the fee, the quicker he would be off this planet and heading somewhere. There was no longer a home for him, and a few of his kind left, but things could change. Yes, they very well might be one day. Hoken leaned back in his chair and let the chatter of the comlinks wash over him. And that is the end of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, coming right at you real soon. Good night, or good morning, or happy midday. See you around.